Dear parents, thank you for taking time to join us here at Unity Connects. The science curriculum seeks to nurture the students as an inquirer. The starting point is that children are curious and want to explore the things around them. The science curriculum leverages on and seeks to fuel this spirit of curiosity. At the end of the day, we want our students to enjoy science, value science as an important tool in helping them explore their natural and physical world, and be a stronger problem solver in their daily life. Through this workshop, parents, you will learn the strategies science teachers use in the classroom to teach answering of open-ended questions. Using questions from the various topics, science teacher will share the use of concept, connection, conclusion, the C3 answering technique to help students respond to such questions. In addition, the marking annotations used by teachers to mark the explained question will be shared to help you support your child in his or her inquiry journey. Let's start by understanding the open-ended question answering techniques. There are different types of questions in the open-ended section. Some can be answered using only one word, while others may require several sentences. You need to know how much detail to give in your answer. Writing more than what is required wastes precious time, while writing too little causes you to lose precious marks. Your child has been taught to pick up words in the question that indicate how they should be answered. For describe type of question, students are required to give relevant details about an object or event, but not required to explain their answer. For explain type questions, they are required to give reasons or making something clear and simple to understand, and we will make use of the C3 answering technique to do so. State type of question is the easiest and usually requires short answers without explanation. If the question asks for an interpretation of what the experiment tells you, students will need to interpret the results of the experiment. Another possible type of question will be asking for what would happen. In other words, we are asking the students to make a prediction. Again, no explanation will be required. Allow me to share with you some examples. This is a describe type of question. A farmer wants to find out if chicks will grow faster by eating corn or rice. Describe how he should carry out the experiment. The answer will be to write down the steps for the experiment as shown in the slides. No explanation is required in this answer. Here's another example of a question involving description. Karen pushed an inverted empty plastic cup in a container of water as shown in the diagram below. While the cup was in the water, Karen pierced a hole at the base of the cup. Describe what she will observe after that. To answer this question, students would simply describe that air bubbles will be seen coming out of the hole as water filled the cup. There is no need to explain why the bubbles are escaping from the hole. Next, this is a state type of question, which is the easiest type of questions that involve short answers. State the conditions necessary for germination. Students simply need to state down the conditions, which are the presence of water, oxygen, and warmth. Let's read the next type of question. What does this activity tell us? If object X is connected to the circuit and the bulb lights up, we can conclude that object X is a conductor of electricity. Again, explanation is not needed for this question. For questions that requires explanation, students will then have to make use of the C3 answering techniques, which stands for concept, connection, and conclusion. Under concept, students will recall what themes or topic the question is testing on. What concepts are being applied here? Students will then have to apply this concept to the questions by stating the evidence that relates to the concept from the diagram, tables, or graphs. What are the comparison made in the questions or the setups of the experiment. Students will then wrap up their answer by concluding the outcome or what happened as a result in the end. To put it simply, we state the concept being tested in the question, we use evidence from the question, and state a conclusion. In the next few slides, we will be sharing with you more examples of explanation questions and how your child can make use of his teacher's marking annotations to help himself or herself improve his or her answer.
Let's move on with our sharing. On this table, you will see the science marking symbols that teachers will be using when marking your child's work. Let's start with the first part, spelling mistakes. So the teacher will underline the word that is spelled wrongly and put a bracket over it to indicate that the child needs to do corrections. Moving on, missing C1, C2 or C3. To show this, the teacher will put a caret at the part of the sentence where the C1, C2 or C3 needs to be inserted, along with a question mark and a cross to indicate incomplete answers. If the student wrongly writes C1, C2 or C3, the teacher will underline the part that is wrong, indicate which one is wrong, C1, C2 or C3, and put a cross. Finally, if the answer is irrelevant, the teacher will just put a cross to indicate that the whole answer is wrong. Now, for the purpose of the sharing, we'll be using questions from Term 1 and Term 2 of the P4 syllabus, mainly matter, the human digestive system, and plant systems. Bear in mind, for the system questions, we'll be focusing on the parts and their functions. And do note that it is important that students understand that each part plays an important role in the entire system. Let's start with example 1. The topic is matter. Mr. Tan molded a piece of plasticine into a sphere as shown in the diagram below. He wanted to measure the volume of the sphere. Mr. Tan prepared the following setup below to show the volume of the sphere. Describe what Mr. Tan should do to find the volume of the sphere using the apparatus he had in the setup above. So the question is basically a describe question that requires the student to explain the process. Let's look at the student's answer. Now, as you can see from the answer, the child is trying to show some understanding of what he needs to do, but is not linking it back to any concepts. So, this answer is considered irrelevant and marked wrong. Let's look at the next slide to see what is the acceptable answer. Now let's look at the acceptable answer. In this answer, the student is expected to not only describe the process of the experiment, the student has to ensure the description is in the correct order, using words like first and then. Finally, the student also needs to explain how the steps help to find the volume of the sphere, because that is the conclusion that is needed. Look at the next part of the question. Miss Tan filled a cup of sand with another 10 cm cube of water. She observed that there was no water or sand spilling out of the cup. Give a reason for this observation. So in this question, we're looking for the student to explain why no water or sand is spilling out of the cup. Let's look at the student's response. The student writes, there was space for the water to occupy. Now, in this case, the student is showing an understanding of the fact that water occupies space. But it does not link back to the question or does not give a conclusion to why no water or sand is spilling out of the cup. So basically C2 and C3 are missing, and therefore the student will not get marks. The acceptable answer starts with, of course, the concept water occupies space. It connects to the question by saying that there is enough space between the grains of sand for the water to occupy. And finally, we come to the conclusion that both the sand and water will not spill out of the cup, as there is enough space in the cup for both. Now, let's move on to the next example. Let's move on to example 2. The topic covered is plant system. Now, this is a flowchart question, and flowchart questions are quite common in science papers. The students are required to look at the picture of the flowchart and extract the information needed to answer the questions. Now, if you look at this particular flowchart, basically it's asking about the functions of different parts of the plant and to identify the correct alphabet to match the correct part of the plant. Now, since leaves make food for the plant, that would mean that the leaves are represented by B. And since the roots absorb water for the plant, that would be represented by A. Now let's look at the second question in example 2. It's still using the same flowchart. For this state type of questions, students need to be very clear of the requirements asked in the questions. In this case, the question is asking for the characteristic of part B, which is the leaves. In the answer given, the student is making a very general statement without focusing on the characteristic of leaves. Characteristic questions are focusing on special features or quality associated with, for example, leaves. For a flowchart, this kind of questions is a bonus as the answers are already stated in the question, and the student will just need to pick out the correct characteristic. The acceptable answer would again take information from the flowchart that part B does not absorb water and it makes food for the plant. So both these pieces of information need to be in the answer. Let's move on to the third question. This question is focusing on the digestive system. Let's read the question together. Ahmad wanted to find out if the size of food affects how fast they are digested. He used two setups X and Y for his experiment. He mixed 120 grams of fish meat with 45 ml of digestive juices in each of the test tubes as shown below. In which setup X or Y will the fish meat be completely digested first? Explain your answer. So if you look at the setup, the biggest difference is in setup X, there is one large piece of meat. In setup Y, there are smaller pieces of fish meat. So let's look at the student's answer. Look at this answer. The student answered this wrongly, as the student did not understand how size or exposed surface area of food is related to the rate of digestion. With the concept wrongly applied, the student ended up with the wrong choice of answer as well. Let's look at the acceptable answer. Student will first need to state their choice of setup. So they have to mention setup Y first. Then using the concept that larger exposed surface area of food for the digestive juice to act on will speed up the rate of digestion. The students will then connect this concept to the question by stating that the fish is cut into smaller pieces will in turn have much larger exposed surface area. Hence, the fish meat in setup Y will be completely digested first. Let's move to example 4, which stays with the topic digestive system. This question requires a student to show an understanding of another important process skill, which is the interpretation and analysis of graphs. Let's look at the question. The graph below represents how the noodles which Linda had eaten during lunch passed through her digestive system. Give a reason why the graph is horizontal at the gullet. So it is another question that requires a reason. The student has correctly picked out the evidence from the graph stating that there has been no change at the gullet. But the student has not actually answered the question fully. There is no explanation as to why this has happened, and so therefore C1 is missing. And so the student will not be getting any marks. Let us look at the acceptable answer. For C1, which is the concept, student has to mention that there is no digestion taking place at the gullet. For the connection, the student has to then mention that that is why the amount of digested food remained the same. And finally, for the conclusion, the student has to mention that that is why the graph is horizontal at the gullet, to show that there is no change in the amount of digested food. Let's look at the second question of example 4. Give a reason why a person will have watery waste when he's suffering from diarrhea. Now for this question, the aim is to apply the knowledge that they have learned to something that they have experienced so that they can make a connection. Let's look at the student's answer. In this answer, the student wrongly assumes that the waste is watery as the food is not being digested at all. This actually does not go back to the concept that has been taught. And also there's no connection to the question and to explain why the person has diarrhea. So the student is not linking back to the function of each organ of the digestive system and its role in the process of digestion. Therefore, the student will not be receiving any marks. Let's look at the acceptable answer. For C1 concept, the student is required to mention that water is absorbed into the body at the large intestine. For C2, connection to the question, when a person is suffering from diarrhea, water from undigested food is not being absorbed into the body. And for C3, the conclusion, the student has to mention that the waste discharged from the body is therefore watery. These three parts will be considered the full answer that is required. Now we have come to the end of our 4 examples. Thank you for joining us for this sharing session. We hope this sharing is beneficial in helping you understand the answering techniques for science questions.